to the CountryWatch Political Intelligence Briefing Quick Hits, a weekly briefing of hot stories across the world in brief. I'm Denise Youngblood-Coleman, Chief Editorial Officer and Senior International Affairs Analyst at CountryWatch. This week I'm doing a special report with regard to China's geostrategic influence, and that influence actually surpasses the Asia-Pacific region. But let's start in the region. Speaking from Japan on an overseas trip to Asia in the third week of May 2022, United States President Joe Biden said that his country would intervene militarily if China attempted to take control of Taiwan by force. Biden was responding to a question about the United States' willingness to go further to help Taiwan than it did with Ukraine if faced with invasion. President Biden unequivocally responded, "Yes, that's the commitment we made." He continued, "We agree with the One China policy. We signed on to it and all the attendant agreements made from there, but the idea that it can be taken by force, just taken by force, is just not appropriate." President Biden's assertion was also sure to alarm China, as it was a departure from long-standing United States policy of strategic ambiguity. The policy of strategic ambiguity is one by which Washington does not expressly state that it will defend Taipei militarily, while simultaneously assisting Taipei in strengthening its military defenses. The United States acknowledges China's position that Taiwan is part of China, but does not officially recognize China's territorial claims over Taiwan. Indeed, the United States provides Taiwan's defensive weapons to defend itself, while maintaining an intentionally ambiguous posture as regards its military assistance to Taiwan in the face of an invasion from mainland China. At the heart of this policy of strategic ambiguity is the dual goal of deterring a Chinese invasion of Taiwan while also curbing Taiwan from making an official declaration of independence from China's grasp. Not surprisingly, Taiwan welcomed Biden's forthright positioning regarding possible threats to its self-rule. On the other side of the equation, China expressed its strong dissatisfaction and firm opposition to Biden's comments and warned that it would not allow any external force to interfere in its internal affairs. This was not the first time that President Biden has made what some might view as controversial references to Taiwan. So as an internationalist whose job is to analyze international affairs, I do not believe that President Biden's remarks on Taiwan can be easily dismissed as a faux pas or a gaffe. As a veteran statesman and a former member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Biden himself voted in 1979 to approve the Taiwan Relations Act. Thus, I believe it is more likely that Biden's remarks are intentional and aimed at delivering a clear message to Beijing, which has been taking a far more aggressive posture as regards Taiwan. The United States and Western allies are also probably concerned about China's growing influence in the wider Asia-Pacific region, particularly with regard to the Solomon Islands. At issue, a controversial military pact between China and the Solomon Islands. The bilateral security agreement between China and the Pacific Island nation first surfaced as rumor in mid-2021. There were suggestions that a security accord was being negotiated that would allow Chinese military personnel and naval vessels to be deployed to the Solomon Islands. Should such an accord come to pass, it would facilitate the establishment of a Chinese military base in the Pacific Ocean, less than 2,000 kilometers from Australia, and at a time when the United States, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand were concerned about Beijing's encroaching geostrategic influence. A draft text of the secret security pact surfaced and made clear that Chinese military and police would be permitted to operate in the Solomon Islands. Anxiety and outrage would only increase when the Chinese foreign minister confirmed that the agreement had been signed. With the existence of the pact now confirmed, Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare insisted on his country's right to make its own sovereign decisions about foreign policy. But the Prime Minister's decisions about foreign affairs were not only being viewed critically from abroad, they had already caused outrage at home from his fellow citizens. In late 2021, the Solomon Islands was rocked by violence, turmoil, and destructive rioting. The capital city of Honiara was devastated by damage, arson, and looting, with the Chinatown region of the city being hardest hit. Significantly, one of the few buildings left standing in Honiara's Chinatown was a building displaying Taiwanese flags. Peacekeepers from Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea were brought in to quell the turmoil. At the heart of the unrest was the decision by the government of Solomon Islands to switch its allegiance in 2019 from Taiwan to mainland China. the divided communities across the islands that make up the archipelago were the cause of intensifying tensions between residents of the island of Guadalcanal, where the capital Honiara is located, and residents of the island of Malaita. While Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare was responsible for the shift in foreign policy, Daniel Sudani, the Premier of Malaita, opposed the move. Premier Sudani vociferously vowed not to engage with Beijing and went so far as to terminate licenses of businesses owned by ethnic Chinese. That move evoked condemnation from the national government in Honiara. The differences on foreign policy orientation moved into scandal territory when Premier Sudani said that he'd been offered a bribe to change his position. For his part, Sogavare dismissed the claim. Regardless of the veracity of the accusation or the denial, the reality was there was grave consternation over the geopolitical shift from Taipei to Beijing. It was fueling socio-political tensions, intensifying them to the proverbial boiling point, and ultimately leading to the eruption of violence in the latter part of 2021. Now, in 2022, the entire issue of switching allegiance from Taipei to Beijing was again in the spotlight, with the news of the secret security agreement being signed by the Sogavare government with China. The presence of Chinese police and military troops on the terrain of Solomon Islands would set off alarm bells for the opposition party and activists, worried that they would be used by the Sogavare government to squash dissent at home. In Washington, D.C., Canberra, and Auckland, the very idea of Chinese military troops, far less for an actual Chinese military base in the Pacific Ocean less than 2,000 kilometers from Australia, could only be regarded with alarm. The fact of the matter was that implications went further than a military presence. Beijing seemed intent on cultivating client states in island countries of the Pacific. That type of vassal relationship would compel Pacific Island nations to defer to Beijing's interests in exchange for infrastructure investment or other forms of assistance. Augmenting Beijing's interests and influence was an online propaganda campaign aimed at undermining traditional allies such as the United States, New Zealand, and Australia in favor of China. It was clear that China would not stop with bringing only Solomon Islands into its orbit as something of a vassal state. Indeed, it would seek to form similar deals with other Pacific Island nations. Among the countries on China's radar, Kiribati, located only 3,000 kilometers from the site of the United States Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. China was looking to form an agreement with Kiribati that would cover much of the same ground as the pact formed with the Solomon Islands. The negotiations between China and Kiribati had in fact been going on for several years, but were now going to overdrive as China sought to establish what could be described as strategic perches in island nations of the Pacific. One project on the China-Kiribati agenda was upgrading an airstrip on Canton Island. In a parallel development, China signed an agreement with Vanuatu to upgrade an international airport in Luganville, which had once been a United States military base during the Second World War. China's investment in developing countries' infrastructure has been part of an ongoing thrust for years as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Under that program, China aims to improve regional cooperation through ameliorated connectivity and improved infrastructure. The locus of the program has been in Central Asia as a modern variant of the Silk Road, but it is in fact an internationally focused initiative. In Africa alone, more than 40 countries are believed to be part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Caribbean island nations, along with its Pacific island nations across the world, also appear to have been targeted in these regards. With the program clearly helping these developing countries in terms of infrastructure improvement, it also ensures Beijing's leverage and influence in countries benefiting from its assistance. Moreover, if a country defaults on repaying Beijing for its investments, it cedes control to Beijing and undermines its own sovereignty. Clearly, the investment by China in these countries were intended to expand Beijing's sway, but as has been the case in Sri Lanka, it can also facilitate China's financial leverage over these countries when they default on debt payments. Meanwhile, it should be noted that China operated a space tracking station in Kiribati until 2003. Ties between China and Kiribati and several other nation-states were severed when they established diplomatic ties with Taiwan. But the foreign relations dynamics changed when Kiribati shifted its own allegiance back to from Taipei back to Beijing in 2019. Restarting a space tracking station in Kiribati could well be the next step, and one that would be invariably unsettling to Washington, D.C., Djibouti, given Kiribati's close proximity to Hawaii. Kiribati was only 3,000 kilometers from Hawaii, where the United States Indo-Pacific Command is located. Since China's military capabilities have improved over the past 2 decades, the presence of any kind of Chinese military foothold in close proximity to Hawaii could only be regarded as alarming by the United States government. I mentioned earlier China's foothold in Africa. One country where we have seen this play out is in the East African country of Djibouti. China has made significant infrastructure investments in Djibouti, which is largely devoid of natural resources, but nonetheless strategically located at the entrance of the Red Sea and relatively stable politically. Since the early 2000s, Chinese investments in Djibouti have included school construction, road renovation, office infrastructure, and even the building of a new foreign ministry building. Chinese investment increased in 2012 under President Xi Jinping and the inauguration of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. One element involved the Chinese-built International Free Trade Zone, where businesses can operate without paying income tax, property tax, dividends, or value-added taxes. But the construction of the railway line between Djibouti and Ethiopia, the gas pipeline between the two countries, and the construction of the Dorale port keenly illustrate Beijing's intent to make Djibouti the Singapore of Africa. Also notable was the establishment of a Chinese military base in Djibouti, which was opened in 2017. Djibouti has been home to several international military bases from France, the United States, and Italian and Japanese troops are also stationed there. But the opening of a Chinese military installation in Djibouti is a whole new arena. China has invested $14 billion in Djibouti between 2012 and 2021. But in accepting this level of capital investment in Djibouti, President Ismail Omar Guelleh has made his country economically dependent on China to the extent that some Horn of Africa experts warn that he risks his country's autonomy. With China holding more than 70% of Djibouti's debt, there is a clear threat to the East African country's sovereignty. Should Djibouti be unable to pay its loans to China, it would be forced to cede control of strategic interests like the new port, as was the case in Sri Lanka. I'll end by mentioning that China has unveiled a disaster relief fund for the Caribbean countries, as it tries to extend its political and economic reach into strategically important regions of the world. The fund was announced during a virtual summit between China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi and its counterparts for 9 Caribbean countries: Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Grenada, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, Barbados, as well as Trinidad and Tobago. To counter China's influence, the United States House of Representatives has passed the American Competes Act of 2022, which includes funding for the State Department for military training in Latin America and the Caribbean, programs to promote economic competitiveness, good governance, human rights, and the rule of law. It also funds long-term resilience in the Caribbean to natural disasters, severe weather events, and a changing ocean environment through the United States Caribbean Resilience Partnership. In other news unrelated to China's strategic moves, Colombia held the first round of its presidential election, with the incumbent president Ivan Duque Marquez ineligible to seek a second term. The 2022 contest was an open race. Because no candidate won an outright majority, the presidential race was going to a second round between the 2 top finishers. Among them would be Gustavo Petro, representing Colombia Humana, a coalition of leftist parties and organizations. Petro was the former mayor of Bogota who unsuccessfully contested the 2018 presidential election. He has also served as a senator and gained notoriety as a former leftist rebel. Petro, who won 40% of the vote share in round 1, would be up against Rodolfo Hernando Suarez, an independent who served as the mayor of Bucaramanga. Hernandez, who famously slapped a city councilman in the face, is sometimes referred to as Colombian Trump. He secured 28% in the first round. Colombia's second round promised to be a close battle between the 2 political outsiders, rather than a contest between the political establishment. The second round will be held later in June 2022. Coming up in future editions, I will return to covering the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression. I'll also cover forthcoming January 6th hearings in the United States House of Representatives. Subscribers can read more about these and other stories at the CountryWatch website at www.countrywatch.com. I'd also like to take this time to mention my comprehensive Afghanistan withdrawal report called Sunset in the Graveyard of Empires, which is available for purchase from the CountryWatch website at www.countrywatch.com and also on amazon.com. Thank you for your time. Have a great day, and remember now, more than ever, we live in an interconnected world.